Yeah, there wasn't a needy person among them. Well, maybe, but that's certainly not true right now. Last Monday morning, I was down at Cherith Brook and there was a young man I'd never met before named Jeff. And he was living at the homeless camp in Westport. And he was so thankful someone had told him about Cherith Brook, this place you could show up and with Jody and Eric and others have some food and some friendship and a shower and which he all needed. He was working somewhere and he needed a tank top and some toothpaste. The gel he had bothered his gums, and he needed a pair of shoes, which unfortunately we didn't have. But he was so thankful for the homeless camp. You know, he said it was just so much less stressful to be able to come home from work and have this safe place he could go to and be a part of. Of course, not everybody was thrilled with it. I mean, I pass it 3 or 4 times a day. It's a tricky intersection. There's already a lot going on, easy to have a wreck. But the homeowners and then of course the store owners right around, the guy who manages the shopping center said, "Oh my God, do you know how many people pass by every day and see this? Tens of thousands." That was the point, right? For people to see it, for people to see one another, for us to see how our sisters and brothers are living, for us to see ourselves too, and how we've shaped and designed this world. I thought reading the stories in the paper about when I was in South Africa in 2006, when I was on a sabbatical there and I was a chaplain at an all girls school. These girls came from different tribal areas. There were 10 homelands where the black Africans in South Africa were kept by the whites. Remember, the whites were 10% of the population, and the blacks and browns were 90%, and the whites controlled it for 3.5 centuries because they had what? A mighty military and unfortunately allies like us who stood behind them and death squads. And the girls at the school were from those homelands and they had come there to go to the school. And I remember we were living next door to a teacher, a young woman, 30, white, and she said, if you ever get a chance to go to one of those homelands, you should. She said, growing up, we were never allowed in. They were protecting the white people so they wouldn't see. It was like if you imagine driving down an interstate and there would be an exit ramp, but then over the hill you couldn't see. I remember you could see the fires in the distance, but you couldn't go on the exit ramp unless you were one of the black people with the pass who was coming out to work in the mines or the maids, or you were one of the white folks with the big buses going to pick them up. But that lifted in 94, when Mandela was elected, and this was a decade later. And I remember we went down to Cape Flats, which is near Cape Town, which is one of the most affluent places on the planet. And we went into Cape Flats, and if you've ever seen abject poverty, it looks the same everywhere. Central America, South Texas, South Africa, the poor live in cardboard and plastic. It's just what the material is. And my kids were little, and maybe because of that, I remember these little children playing in this little section of it. There were like 54 homes, just plastic and cardboard, and one spigot. There was no running water or electricity, but this one spigot of water, a well that the 54 households lived in, used that water. And there were 6 million people in that community living like that. But people didn't have to see it. And then as apartheid was coming down, sort of, the ideas of how people wanted to keep people away became more and more crazy and bizarre. I remember going to the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg, and some architect in like the late 80s had literally come up with this plan where the black people could have a little bit more and the white people would live in these elevated cities. It was like the Jetsons. I mean, they had these drawings how white people would live up on these stilts and they'd have these aero cars, literally like the Jetsons, but then they wouldn't have to see the black people, right? But, I've thought about that a little bit because, well, our interstate system, now that Biden is kind of using it as a little bit of a reparations. I mean, I think we all know it, but I didn't really get it until I was a young adult, like how much the interstate and the highways just decimated communities of color. And you see things sometimes more clearly when you move to a new community. So I was like 25 when I moved here, and I could see how I-35 and Southwest Boulevard and Southwest Trafficway, like they just went right through the Hispanic community, right? They took out houses and businesses and schools and churches. 71 went right through the African American community. And it was all over the country. There were 1 million people displaced by all those highways and interstates. And, we know kind of what happened. I mean, they made the world better for a lot of people, right? We used our tax money to build roads and really kind of subsidize development and moving away and being further apart. I didn't really think about it until I heard some podcast this week that, gosh, all that was going on, kind of like the Confederate statues that we think of as being from the 1860s, but they're really from the 1960s, kind of during the civil rights movement. Like those interstates and highways, it was kind of like just as African Americans were winning separate but equal schools. Yeah, like we built these interstates so that one group of people could really be away from another group of people. But we do it to ourselves too. It's almost like by design, somehow we're just made not to really show other people where we're hurting. You've heard me say that a million times. When you meet someone for the first time, the first thing you want to know is where they're vulnerable. And the last thing you really want them to see is where you are. I just think about that, and I'll tell some of you, because some of you, I'll just say, I've known you long enough. You always look good. So you've got to tell me when your life is exploding because I cannot read it on your face. And this week I was with a guy, great guy. Oh my gosh, could not be in a worse industry during COVID. I mean, just been obliterated. And we've been chatting for maybe an hour, and I was kind of trying to draw him out, trying to, hear how he was doing. And we were just about to leave, and then he finally said, yeah, my mental health is just in shambles. I mean, we find a way, though, not really to show that. It's not just the interstate. We got the internet, right? It's another way to kind of separate us, to separate ourselves from our soul. I mean, we know that, that survey that showed that 8th graders would rather text their friends on Friday night than be with their friends on Friday night. I just can't quit thinking about that. That is just so horrible. Well, maybe it wouldn't be if all of our kids were so happy. And they're just like the level of happiness and joy among young people today. But no, folks, since 2011, which happened to be like when every single person had a cell phone, like the rates of depression and anxiety and suicide, right, which is forever, have just gone through the roof. It's like what they say, mental illnesses that are around internalization. Relationships not so much of an issue anymore because nobody has them. But so it's like, how do we figure out a way to get closer to one another, to get closer to our soul, and to share with one another? The early church had a different design altogether. And we're told this twice right early here in the book of Acts. In the 2nd chapter, the 4th chapter, it's just repeated, right? Like, do you not remember you preached a sermon like week before last, dude? But it's like, first we're told in the 2nd chapter, what? They were all together in one place. They were all together in one place. You can't really like make a substitute for being with people, for seeing them, for realizing, oh, this is where you live, you don't have any running water, or for just sitting with a friend on their front porch when their heart is breaking because their child is sick and they cannot save them right this moment to make it better, right? I mean, they were all together in one place. We have got to get together in some ways, or we've got to find ways to keep being real and not playing the same 2-minute loop over and over again. And then there was not a needy person among them. I mean, they just shared everything. And the thing about this passage is it doesn't sound like drudgery, like, oh, damn it, I got to write a check for, the trash can, trash liners for the Boy Scouts. I don't want to part with my $25. No. These people were friggin' happy, right? They were, everyone took what they had and joyously gave it to them. And this is the deal. Those rare instances where you see people sharing this way, it's not like drudgery and sadness. People look happy. I only go to Cherith Brook because it makes me feel better, because the people who live there are so friggin' happy and full of joy. And I remember when I was in South Africa, the strongest memory I have from all of it were of the little girls singing every single morning. I went to church every single morning, 350 black girls in Eden. And the singing, oh my gosh. They would sing for hours. I mean, if you didn't make them go to class, they would just sing. They would sing in English and Zulu and Xhosa. They would sing up the valley, down the, just over and over and over again, just the incredible. And they sang so beautifully, especially when it was time for the offering, because then they could really dance. Then they could dance up the aisles. They were taking up an offering for the needy kids, unlike these girls who each had one shirt and maybe one pair of skirt, and they would share socks. They maybe would have lost their pair, so like one friend would wear one sock one day and the other friend would, and they would bring their little offering, their penny, dancing up the aisle, and it'd be like 7 or 8 girls holding each a corner of that penny, right? And just the joy. I mean, they had one penny among 7 or 8, putting it in an offering plate. Or I think about those kids I saw one time, it's been about 30 years ago, up in Pennsylvania. It was some kind of peace conference, and these folks were the Bruderhof. Maybe you've heard of them. They live in New York and Pennsylvania and maybe in Germany and around. They're like Amish or Mennonite. They live exactly like this chapter in Acts. They don't own anything together. They pool everything and they farm, or they have some kind of community asset they create together, and they just live in a, they have their separate homes, but everything is shared. And these children were singing, and they were like the Amish and Mennonite, except for they looked like Laura Ashley meets the Amish. Their little pinafores, the little girls, looked like an English garden. And they were singing like these Peter, Paul, and Mary and Joan Baez songs. I'll never forget the joy. There was this song, and if you take me by the hand, and so maybe a decade later when I was building a church and we were furnishing it, I remember their parents made furniture, and we filled that church, the sanctuary chairs, the whole sanctuary and all the children's with these beautiful wooden furniture made. And I could go in there, even now, I can picture that, and I can hear those little kids singing. Such joy. And it's not just little kids. Old people can be joyful too when they're sharing. I remember again about that time, this trip I took, which anybody who was on it, it's like you can meet people. If they've got the t-shirt that says Pastors for Peace Caravan in El Salvador, they can just tell you the whole thing. It was like 1994. It was when the war was ending. That war, those wars that are really kind of the backbone of why all these people keep coming to our country, because we helped fuel all these wars in Central America. But there was such a sense of solidarity at that time, such a sense of hope that the peasants and the people would rise up and live in a new way. And there were all these communities around the United States and around the world that were in solidarity with these little peasant communities in El Salvador. And just as the war was ending and people were coming back home to kind of rebuild, well, they had nothing. I mean, the war, the brutality, the death squads, the violence. I mean, more people were killed. Just slaughtered and all of it. And the people were coming back to rebuild. So they had this giant caravan, started in Portland, Maine, Portland, Oregon, up in Wisconsin, Minnesota. And these giant, moving vans would come through each community around the United States where people had sister communities. They would stop and they would get like a hoe and a rake and baking dishes and things people needed who had absolutely nothing. And some of you may remember that there are like 6 communities here in Kansas City. We gathered at Visitation Parish and we brought what we had to share to our little community of El Ural. And then they whined, they kept driving, and they finally, all these vans converged in South Texas before they went into Mexico and kept going. It was a dangerous trip. There was still a lot of death squads, a lot of activity, and some of us were able to fly then to San Salvador and be there when those vans arrived, to be able to then accompany them to these communities and be there for truly this moment of resurrection. And I remember we were in this soccer stadium in San Salvador, and all the moving vans were arriving there before we went out to the communities. It was filled with activists and Pastors for Peace and Veterans for Peace, all these Vietnam veterans, Cindy Holscher and Rick Blumhorst, their dad, that kind of a person were all there. And people were like punch drunk by that point because they'd been driving, some of these van drivers, for 6 weeks, just messy and dirty. And there was this guy in this woman's pink blouse. And I meant to have Elizabeth Duke show the pictures and I forgot to, so I'll just have to really paint a picture for you. He was maybe 40 something and he had this woman's pink peasant blouse on. And I was thinking, well, my gosh, these guys have been driving so long. Their clothes are dirty, their laundry, he just pulled something off of the van and the first thing was this woman's pink blouse. Well, then I came to realize, no, he just wears women's clothing. He's from Wyoming. He teaches power technology at Casper College. That wasn't that common in 1994. And you could tell by the way people talked to him, he was everybody's favorite person. Sissy is what he went by. If you ever broke down by the road, Sissy was your person. You needed somebody to help you build your fence or repair your gutter. You needed somebody to go anywhere on the planet to build some kind of power plant or put in water sources or do something for somebody. You wanted somebody who had been in the midst of war who said, let me tell you folks, there's a different way to live. And after that, I mean, I've heard stories about him, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Citicorp. His life wasn't always easy. He was born in a family where his mother was an alcoholic and his father was abusive, and he realized early on that he felt better, safer wearing little girls' clothes. Maybe people are just more tender with the little girls. It wasn't always easy. He got an honorable discharge in Vietnam when someone found him wearing a woman's pink nightgown in the Air Force somewhere in the middle of the jungle. And then when he was getting married, he was engaged, he told his wife that he wore women's clothing. She said, well, I guess that's okay. She laughed about it later, said, I didn't know he'd take up 2/3 of the closet. There were rough moments, of course, when people beat him and beat him, and there were moments, of course, when he almost got fired at the college, but then his students showed up. Boys in Casper, Wyoming, showed up with hoodies on. They took their hoodies off. They all had on little peasant blouses with bows in their hair, right? He died this last March of brain cancer. But what a person and what a journey. Like, who gets in a moving van in Casper, Wyoming and drives for 6 weeks, comes down there through really dangerous territory just to share with people. But oh my goodness, the real long journey, you know, right, was to himself, was to say, you know who I am? I'm a person who can't make it without wearing women's clothing. This is who I am, world. This person that God made, created this way, to live this way. Yeah, I don't think this happens very often. I really don't think it happens very often. I don't see it. I don't see it myself. I want to. I want to be more generous and more quick to share and more honest about who I am and bring up my shoes and share them and create a different world. But now and then it does happen, doesn't it? Now and then you see a glimpse of it. Little kids with the penny, a penny shared among 6 or 7 who happily put it in the plate. Now and then you see people who really risk everything to live in a little house on the northeast side, somehow trusting that God will care for them, even though they're not putting anything aside for the future. Sometimes you see a man who realizes the way I can live fully is by wearing a little pink dress. May this Easter season be a time when we each risk making some journeys too, reaching deep into ourselves, being willing to share, and being willing to offer to this world the resurrection spirit that surely is in all of us. Amen.